Hello, today we're going to make my mother's rolls, Shirley's rolls. And you can see the ingredients that I'm going to use, and I'll also put the recipe itself in the comments, okay? So the first thing we're going to do is scald 1 cup of milk. And again, I use full fat milk. The taste is so much better. So I've got a cup of milk. I've got everything laid out for this recipe. Remember, mise en place. It helps to be ready. So I pour it into a little saucepan. Put it on the stove. And voila, we have a cup of scalded milk. How do you know it's scalded? You'll see steam rise. You might see little bubbles along the edges or a little skim. Do not bring it to a boil. Scalded is just before the boil. So I've got my nice big bowl. I'm going to pour this milk in, and I'm immediately going to add the 2 tablespoons of sugar and the 2 tablespoons of shortening. Now, I use butter flavor Crisco. It's just what I use. So now you want to get that stirred up nice so that the Crisco melts in. Keep stirring it. While this is happening, while the Crisco is melting and everything's getting stirred together, you're going to want to prep your yeast. Now, the instructions call for 1 package of dry yeast. I keep my yeast in these nice containers. This is the dry. Since I buy it in a big quantity, I don't have 1 package, but 1 package is 2 1/4 teaspoons. So that's what I do. And you want to soften your yeast in warm water. So I warmed up this water in my water pot. Warm water for yeast is between 100 and 110 degrees. I try to keep it under 105. And my handy dandy little thermometer says that this water is 99. So I'm going to dump out a little bit and add a little bit more. Hot water from the pot. Okay, now that's brought it up to 102. That's perfect. So I'm going to take the yeast that I have already measured out and put it in to soften the yeast. Now yeast, active dry yeast, needs to soften in warm water. Instant yeast does not, but this recipe of my mother's, which is very old, it's at least 50 years old, and I have no idea where she got it from. But anyway, this recipe calls for active dry yeast, which is now being softened and being activated in warm water. Meanwhile, I'm stirring, getting the Crisco dissolved, because this milk has to cool down a little bit before I add the yeast. And usually it takes, 5 minutes more or less for the yeast to soften up in the water. Let me grab a spoon. That's one thing that I should have done when I did my mise en place. Shame on me. Anyway, so I'm stirring up the yeast a little bit. So you can see how beautiful the yeast looks. It's going to start bubbling on top, and that shows that the yeast is nice and strong and ready to do its job. This kind of yeast really likes sugar because it eats up the sugar, and that helps things rise in beautiful bread dough. All right, back to my big bowl, stirring. I've still got clumps of the shortening, as you can see, so. And I don't worry, it doesn't 100% melt during this phase, but when I mix it in, the flour in, then everything, you know, combines together beautifully, so it's not going to be a problem. Mixing and mixing and feeling to see if it's lukewarm, which it is. It is lukewarm. But I'm not ready. I mean, the yeast is getting pretty darn close. It's getting nice and foamy on top. So what I can do while I'm waiting, I didn't show you this one, I was showing you my tools. It's a digital thermometer and it's wonderful. You can get one fairly reasonably and comes in handy for a lot of things. So digital thermometer, good tool. Anyway, egg. We need 1 egg. Nice fresh egg from my chickens. Dump it in a bowl. You know, you always put an egg in its own bowl before you add it to anything, because heaven forbid there'd be something weird inside the egg. You know, we don't need that. So let's just mix up this egg a little bit before we add it to the rest of the ingredients. There, no problem. All right, I think we're just about ready to add the yeast. So here we go. I'm putting in the yeast. Nice, foamy. Gonna knock off the extra. Stir that in. Now it looks, you know, kind of brown, but that's the yeast, and the yeast is doing its job. And then I'll stir in the egg. Bread that has some sweetness to it, and this has 2 tablespoons of sugar, and has an egg in it, is called enriched. The dough is enriched with fat, and that makes it softer and yummy, of course. All right, so there's the egg. And now we've got to add the flour and the salt. If you're using active yeast, the yeast and the salt can go in at the same time, but I said active yeast. I meant instant. Instant yeast doesn't care about the salt. Active yeast, I worry that the salt is going to hinder it. So what I like to do is I like to add some flour and then add some yeast. So the recipe calls for 3 cups of flour. Now I didn't measure this out ahead of time because since we're working in cups and not ounces and grams, you need to fluff up the flour in your flour container before you add it to the dough. So that's what I'm doing. I'm going in and mixing it up. And now I'll measure the first cup. Level it off. Stir it in. And now I'm going to add the salt, the 1 teaspoon of salt. Get it stirred up really well. And then add my second cup of flour. Fluff it up a little bit. See, I level it off after I fill the cup. All right, here's number 2. Stir it in. Number 3. All right, I've added all my flour. Now mix it really well. Give it a good hearty stir. You want to scoop in all the flour, and if there's any of the shortening caught along the edges or whatever, give it a good stir. Nice wooden spoon with a big spoon end. It's good for this. All right. Now it's ready to rest and to rise. So here's what it looks like. All stirred up. I'm gonna use one of my bowl scrapers to get the dough off the spoon. We don't want to waste any of the dough if we can help it. And I'm going to put my silicone lid on top of it to cover it so it stays warm inside. And now I have my dough mat here. I'm going to plug it in. And this is going to set for 2 hours. So I am going to pause now, and I'll come back in 2 hours. Okay, 2 hours have passed, and I want you to see how beautiful the dough is in the bowl, how much it's risen up before I empty the bowl. There you go. And now we're ready to move on to the next step. As I showed you, the dough has risen up beautifully. So I'm going to take my handy dandy flour, I don't know what it's called. It's this really old Tupperware thing that sprinkles flour onto a work surface. I don't even know if they make them anymore, but anyway, comes in handy. And I'm going to empty the bowl onto my breadboard surface. It's gonna slide out. I'll just set it upside down for a minute or two. And then I'll use my bowl scraper to finish clearing it out. Oh yeah, it's a beautiful thing. You can smell the yeastiness. It's a good smell. Get all the dough out of the bowl, because again, we don't want to waste any. And this bowl scraper comes in very handy for that, because it's got the rounded edge so it can get into the bowl. All right. And now I'm going to put some flour on top so that I can handle it without it just sticking to me. And it doesn't need much handling. It's beautiful in that I use my bench tool to get it started. In that it's a nice dough that has risen for a couple hours. So I don't need to knead it for 10 minutes. But I need to incorporate it into a nice mass. Get the dough off my fingers by rubbing them with some flour. There. And then just a minute or so of some light kneading. And I mean light. Just kind of moving it around. Making sure it's a nice ball of dough. maybe a scotch more flour. Okay. And now it's ready. Use my rolling pin. This is just a generic rolling pin. And roll it out until it's about, oh gosh, I don't know, an inch maybe, an inch thick. And then I take my handy dandy biscuit cutter. This was my mother's. It's been used, I can't tell you how many times, and it's certainly made batches of these rolls. It measures about 2.5 across. If you can find one, this I think is 2 3/4. You know, you can find just a round circle like a cookie cutter. Anyway, this is a family heirloom, so I'm going to start making the cuts. And usually the first time around I get 8. They're really sticky, so I'll give myself a little flour to get the edges of the biscuit cutter in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And now I've got a baking sheet with some parchment paper on it. Parchment paper is wonderful. I use it almost everything that I bake. I buy it in this giant 250-foot roll. And now I'm going to start setting the rolls onto the parchment paper. And after I get all the rolls from the first cutting, you gather up the dough again, roll it out again, and do another cutting. All in all, you're going to get about 15, maybe 16 rolls. It's hard to say exactly how many, but just keep doing this. Lay them out on the baking pan, and when you've got them all cut out, you're going to cover them nicely with a cotton towel. If you use a big sheet of plastic wrap to cover your bowl because you don't have one of these nice silicone lids like I do, you could take the plastic wrap and lay it over and then put a cloth on top. But I'm gonna, when I get all done, I'm gonna set mine back on my heat mat, my dough mat, and I'm gonna let them sit and raise for 45 more minutes. So I'm gonna finish up here, and then I'll be back to see you in 45 minutes, okay? So the rolls have finished their 45-minute rising since they were there. And they look good. They've risen up nicely. They're puffed up. I've got 15. I should have said before I ended the last segment that when there's about 15 minutes left, I start the timer, I start preheating the oven so that when the timer's up, the oven's all preheated at 425 degrees. So we're ready to pop them into the oven, and they'll bake for at least 10 minutes, sometimes 11. You just don't want the bottoms to get too brown. So we're popping into the oven. And we'll check back in 10 minutes. Hey, so here they are. I actually had to give them another minute because I wanted to make sure the tops of the rolls were brown enough. But this is what they look like. Nice brown little beautiful buns. I try to take them off the pan as soon as I can because I don't want the bottoms to get too brown. You know, they're just the right shade of golden brown now, and they're hot. But anyway, this is what they look like. I am going to include them in supper today, and you could be making them also. So I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I enjoyed getting it ready for you. Look for the recipe in the comments. Leave me any questions, comments that you would like. And that's it for now. There'll be more videos to come. Okay, have a good day.